I love science fiction. I'm a scientist by training. I love science. The problem is not science. The problem is not even science fiction. The problem is that these people are bad at reading science fiction and don't understand science. It's not so much that they take it seriously, they take it literally. They take it as a blueprint for the future when that's never what fiction is. And so I think talking about the future in a different way, I think is part of the solution, and making it clear, the stuff we've been told about AI and the stuff that we've been told about, our glorious future in space and the stuff we've been told about technology, it's hot nonsense. That's not happening.
That was journalist and astrophysicist Adam Becker. In this episode of Overshoot, we discuss his latest book, More Everything Forever, AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity, about the wildly implausible and profoundly immoral visions that tech billionaires have for the future.
Welcome to Overshoot, where we tackle today's interlocking social and ecological crises driven by humanity's excessive population and consumption. On this podcast, we explore needed narrative, behavioral, and system shifts for recreating human life in balance with all life on Earth. I'm Nandita Bajaj, co-host of the podcast and executive director of Population Balance.
I'm Alan Ware, co-host of the podcast and researcher with Population Balance. With expert guests covering a range of topics, we examine the forces underlying overshoot, the patriarchal pronatalism that fuels overpopulation, the growth-obsessed economic systems that drive consumerism and social injustice, and the dominant worldview of human supremacy that subjugates animals and nature. Our vision of shrinking toward abundance inspires us to seek pathways of transformation that go beyond technological fixes toward a new humanity that honors our interconnectedness with all of life. And now on to today's guest. Adam Becker is a journalist and astrophysicist. He is the author most recently of More Everything Forever, which the New York Times called smart and wonderfully readable. He is also the author of What is Real, a book on the sordid, untold history of quantum physics. In addition to his books, Adam has written for the New York Times, the BBC, NPR, Fortune, The Guardian, Scientific American, Quanta, and many others. He has a PhD in cosmology from the University of Michigan, and he lives in California. And now on to today's interview.
Hi, Adam, and welcome to the Overshoot podcast. We're absolutely thrilled to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here.
And Adam, your latest book, which is the subject of today's interview, is called More Everything Forever, AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. Great title. And given your background in astrophysics, we're excited about delving into your science-based critique of what you call, quote, a jumbled mix of shallow futurism and racist pseudoscience, end quote.
Yes.
Which is driving so many of these tech billionaires' delusional and dangerous dreams of a techno-utopian future. And in contrast to these Silicon Valley elites' arrogant belief in more everything forever, here at Population Balance, we believe, much like you, in the humility of more of some things like flourishing nature, less of others like shallow materialism, for a time, recognizing that we are mortal. So we'd like to begin this conversation with some of the more fantastical visions in Silicon Valley. And then we'd like to go deeper into how their ideas and the immense wealth and power behind them are shaping the choices we make here on Earth. And you describe on your website that your book is an attempt to expose how, quote, Silicon Valley's heartless, baseless, and foolish obsessions with escaping death, building AI tyrants, and creating limitless growth are about oligarchic power, not preparing for the future. This is a lot to consider, and you do it so compellingly in your book. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, several things. In some sense, this book is just my response to living in the San Francisco Bay Area for over a decade and being unhappy with certain things that I've seen out here in the culture and seeing those things filter out into the wider world. But also, I'm a physicist by training, and my first book was about quantum physics. And while I was writing that book, a whole bunch of horrible things started happening all around the world, but especially right here in the US. We had the 2016 election. In the UK, there was Brexit. There just seemed to be like a resurgence of far-right fascist authoritarian nationalism around the world and democratic backsliding in countries that were previously thought to be stable democracies. And I thought, what am I doing here, sitting here writing about quantum physics while the world is burning? And promised myself that if I got the opportunity to write another book, that it would be something more sort of directly politically relevant. And when I started thinking about what that might mean, I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that something about how Silicon Valley gets science wrong might be interesting and might be something that I was sort of well placed to write about. And as I started working on that, it sort of morphed from, Silicon Valley doesn't understand science, though they by and large don't, into something broader about Silicon Valley's ideas about the future, why they don't work and where they come from. And I finished this book before the 2024 election here in the US. And when I finished the book, thought that I was going to have to do a lot of work convincing people that no, the tech billionaires really don't have our best interests at heart. And Elon Musk really is a horrible person and so on and so forth. And then, between finishing the book and the publication of the book, the strangest thing happened.
Yeah. I think that's what's so refreshing about your book, too, is so many of us, especially, on the progressive left, we kind of see through the delusional nature of these billionaire fantasies, but don't have necessarily the scientific critique that's required to say, no, none of it's possible or probable. Like a lot of people will say, well, Elon Musk is so smart, but he's taken a turn to the right. But having someone like you come in and just say, no, none of this, they like to call it science, but it's not really science. It's just money. And they like to think that money has bought them expertise, which it hasn't.
Or they like to think that they have the money as proof of their intelligence, right? They're smart. And you can tell that they're smart because they're wealthy, when the fact is that that has more to do with luck than anything else.
Yes, exactly. And I think the reason these ideas have spread as pervasively as they have, and you've spoken about this as well, is also because of a lot of gullible journalists who are trading away their ability to criticize these billionaires in order to gain access. And then they're writing about the hype in the way that the billionaires intend for them to write. So we're not really getting good scientific critique from journalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Going back to your first question in a way, after I figured out what the book was, but before I'd sort of really gotten into it, I definitely had a moment, or more than a moment, where I thought, what have I gotten myself into? This is a book that really should be written by a tech journalist. I'm a science journalist. What am I doing? And then as I got further into it and realized what the book was, or how it had to be in order for me to write it, I realized, I think, as is always the case with anyone's book, it's a book that only I could write, right? But also a tech journalist, by and large, can't write this, because tech journalists do mostly rely on access. And, you write a book like this, you lose that access, and then you can't do tech journalism anymore, which is not to say that all tech journalists are only working based on access, but for a lot of them, that's what's going on. And I had no such problem because I never had any access to begin with, which is why there's a list at the end of the book of people who I attempted to interview, but who said no.
And you do share some things with these delusional tech billionaires, which is your love for science fiction, which also gives you credibility to write about the things they continue to believe in as real, even though they were always meant to be fictional.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that there's this strange cultural shift that's happened where, back in like the 80s, nerds were not seen as a dominant cultural force, Whereas now the biggest movies in the world are comic book movies and science fiction movies, or science fiction comic book movies. And also the wealthiest people in the world are people who work in, a culturally nerdy industry, the tech industry. But I still think that there's this idea that if you go after people for liking science fiction, then you're punching down in a way. I'm like, no, I'm a science fiction fan. I love science fiction. I'm a scientist by training. I love science. The problem is not science. The problem is not even science fiction. The problem is that these people are bad at reading science fiction and don't understand science. It's not so much that they take it seriously. They take it literally. They take it as a blueprint for the future when that's never what fiction is. And it's certainly never what good fiction is. Anything that was written as a blueprint for the future is going to be trash. It's not going to read well. Great art is never meant as a blueprint. And I, as a science fiction fan, of course, believe that a great deal of science fiction is great art, or at least some of it is. People laugh when I say this, but I think Star Trek is great art. Or, there's a lot of Star Trek. Some Star Trek is great art, right? Obviously, something with that many hours of episodes, not all of them are going to be amazing, but some of them really are. And it's not meant as a blueprint for the future. Or insofar as it is, it's not about a glorious future in space. It's about a future where we treat each other better. And it's really about the present. And it's never been subtle about that, as I talk about in the book. One of the arguments against it being great art, and I think it's a misguided argument, but it is true, that Star Trek is very direct in its metaphors about the present. Star Trek is not attempting to be subtle when it talks about problems in the world here and now, and that's what almost every single Star Trek episode is about.
And meanwhile, as you note, according to Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Sam Altman, and more, the only good future for humanity, their sci-fi they'd like to make real is one powered by fantastical technology with trillions of humans living in space, functionally immortal, served by superintelligent AIs. And as you note, these are wildly implausible and profoundly immoral visions of tomorrow. And in reality, there's no good evidence that they will or should come to pass. That's a great summary. And we'd love to get into some of the specifics of why those off-planet dreams are delusional. Like you, we also agree that calling out their delusions is a useful social practice. We need some well-deserved ridicule targeted at them. But first, we'd like an overview of the basics. Why do Musk, Bezos, and space enthusiasts think we need to leave Earth? And what are they proposing?
Yeah. Credit where credit's due for Musk. He's been fairly consistent about this over the last 10, 15 years. There's all sorts of stuff he's been massively inconsistent about and deadlines he's blown through. But he has been saying for quite some time that we need a backup for humanity on Mars. And that's in case an asteroid hits Earth or, nuclear war, something that kills off everyone on Earth. We need a backup for humanity on a second planet. And he thinks Mars is suitable for that. And so to achieve that, he wants to put 1 million people living in a colony on Mars by 2050. Bezos has a somewhat different vision. He thinks that the problem is that resources on Earth are limited. And so if we just stay on Earth, growth has to end eventually. But he does recognize, credit where credit's due for Bezos, he recognizes that there are no other planets in our solar system where we could live. And so his proposed solution is to put hundreds of thousands of enormous space stations into orbit around the sun at roughly the same distance as the Earth, to have a population of, and this is the number he's given, 1 trillion people living in the solar system. He says, that way we could have 1,000 Mozarts and 1,000 Einsteins. And then Earth would mostly not have people living on it and it could be like a giant park. And, other billionaire and non-billionaire space enthusiasts talk about similar things, right? These are often the reasons given. There's a third one that's often given, which is, we need to have a frontier for sort of psychological and psychosocial reasons, cultural reasons. It's important for there to be a frontier, and space is, the final frontier. And there's also stuff that Musk talks about. He talks about we have to preserve the light of consciousness by making human civilization multiplanetary. Or there's this guy whose name I don't remember. I mentioned him in the book. He's a venture capital dude who says, humanity faces a choice. Either we can expand out into the stars forever, or we can fade away. And this is the way that they talk about this. It's either growth or death. And if you push them on that, they'll say something like, well, in 5 or 6 billion years, the sun is going to expand and start to die. And if they know a little bit more, they'll say, actually, in less time than that, in about 1 billion years, the sun is going to be so hot that the oceans will start to vaporize and you'll get a runaway greenhouse effect here on Earth, and Earth will turn into a planet a bit more like Venus, which is a terrible place. And both of those things are true to the best of our scientific knowledge. So, you asked me to explain what they believe and why they believe it. And that's the answer to that question. What's the next question?
Based on your background as an astrophysicist, why are they so biophysically delusional? The Mars stream and Bezos stream.
Yeah. So let's start with Musk. Basically, the problem is that Mars is terrible. Mars is just an absolutely awful place. There's so many reasons why Mars is a horrifying place to live, and it can't support long-term, large-scale human life. Yeah, I get into a lot of that in the book, but to give a shorter answer than I give there, the radiation levels are too high, the gravity is too low, there's no air, and the dirt is made of poison. There's no biosphere there. To support human life, you would have to build an entire self-contained biosphere, because Musk, to go back to his plans for a second, he didn't just say he wants 1 million people living on Mars. He said that the colony has to be self-sufficient in case the rockets stop coming. So you can't just have food shipped in from Earth. It has to all be set up there, which, if you want to have a completely independent city on Mars, then yeah, it can't be dependent on rockets from Earth. The problem is that that's not going to happen. Well, one of the problems is that that's not going to happen. It's not going to work for so many reasons. There's all the stuff I just said, right? Here on Earth, we have 2 main things that protect us from radiation in space, our Earth's magnetic field and our thick atmosphere. Mars has neither of those things. Here on Earth, we have an atmosphere that we can breathe. Mars doesn't have that. Here on Earth, we have a biosphere that grows food. Food literally grows on trees here. Mars doesn't have that. Mars also doesn't have the ecological necessities for growing plants. Musk talks a lot about terraforming Mars, making it more like Earth so you could get a biosphere going there. He's suggested doing that, and I swear to God, I'm not making this up. He has suggested doing that by detonating nuclear weapons over the Martian polar ice caps in order to melt them, and he says that will create a thick enough atmosphere to support plant life, and then you put plants there, and that puts oxygen in the atmosphere to support human life. He is wrong. There's not enough there to support plant life. He was told that multiple times, and he just didn't listen. He said, no, you're wrong, and didn't cite anything. He just thinks that he knows better than everyone because he has more money. He says that this is a good plan in case an asteroid hits Earth. More asteroids hit Mars than hit Earth. It's closer to the asteroid belt. And even if an asteroid as big as the one that killed off all the dinosaurs except for the birds 66 million years ago, that big famous asteroid impact, the worst single day in the history of complex life on Earth, that day was a better day for being alive than any day on the surface of Mars, probably ever, certainly in the last couple billion years. We know this because we're here. There were mammals that were on Earth at the time, and those mammals survived that day. Even some of the dinosaurs survived. That's why we have birds. Birds are dinosaurs. There's no mammal or bird, or I think any vertebrate. There might be a couple invertebrates, but I am pretty sure no vertebrate, definitely no mammal, could survive on the surface of Mars without a spacesuit for more than 10 minutes. Tops, probably less, quite a bit less. And yet, those mammals that survived 66 million years ago, pretty sure they didn't have spacesuits. Pretty sure they didn't have thermal insulation and all that stuff. They could burrow into the ground or go underwater, and that was about it. And that's how a lot of them survived. That might be how all of them survived. There were massive firestorms around the Earth. It's possible that actually the entire Earth's atmosphere was for a few minutes turned up to an oven set at broiling. That's still better A few minutes of that is still better than being on the surface of Mars. One last thing, 1 million people's not enough. If you want to have a fully independent civilization that can survive without anything from Earth, you need to have everyone on that planet sort of filling in all of the functions of a high-tech economy that like we have here on Earth, except probably even higher tech to survive the rigors of Mars. Somehow, if you somehow solve all those other problems. The best guess from economists about how many people you need to actually do all the things you have to do to get an economy like that running is somewhere around 500 million to 1 billion people. Musk is certainly not putting 1 million people on Mars. He's definitely not putting 1 billion people on Mars. So yeah, Mars, no way. As for Bezos, those space stations, I mean, come on. 100,000 space stations, each one with 10 million people on it, each one bigger than the island of Manhattan. Getting that much material into orbit and just to build one of those, that would be a challenge unlike anything human technology has ever taken on. We don't know how to do it. It's not just a matter of technology. It's also a matter of basic science that has to, scientific questions that have to be answered that, could very well come up. Oh, you can't do that. Even if you could build one of those, which is a pretty big if, what would you have? You would have 10 million primates in a can surrounded by the cold vacuum of space. And all you need for everyone in that can to die is for 1 or 2 people to go crazy and open a window. Which, to be fair, there aren't any windows to open terribly easily, right? But one crazy enough person could manage to open a window, open a pipe, open a vent. Like, it's very, very easy for something to go wrong. Also, you're talking about a wholly artificial, completely contained biosphere that can support 10 million people? Are you serious? And now you want to do that 100,000 times to support 1 trillion people? I think that you would have to do an awful lot of work to show that the carrying capacity of the solar system is that large. Even if you strip mine Earth and every other planet, I am not convinced that you can do that. Yes, the energy from the sun is there, but that is not the only thing you need.
You had mentioned in the book that I'm not sure what energy growth rate, but 3,700 years from now, we'd be using the energy of all the stars in the observable universe?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Bezos says that we need to do this because in a few hundred years, if we continue growing our energy usage, we'll be using all the energy that the Earth receives from the sun. That's true. And there's also thermodynamic limits that would cause the temperature on Earth to rise to an unsurvivable point at around the same time. But if he wants to keep that trend going out into the solar system the way he wants to only buys another 1,000 years. And then if you spot him a warp drive that lets you go faster than the speed of light, that only spots you about another 3,000 years, I think. And so then you're using all of the energy in the observable universe. So you can do that. Or you can say, oh, hey, yeah, maybe growth ends. Maybe that's okay. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with Bezos's ideas as well. And yeah, I mean, fundamentally, a lot of this is about these guys not understanding that growth can end and that's okay.
Right. And then you also talk about another branch of this off-planet futurism, which imagines escaping our sun's eventual death by uploading human minds into machines. And there's people like Ray Kurzweil, head engineer at Google, who argue that this merging of mind and machine is both inevitable and desirable. And critical to this faith is the belief that AI development will achieve something they call artificial general intelligence, AGI. And there seems to be more than a little bit of confusion about what AGI means. And you suggest that this confusion may be intentionally generated. Can you help us understand what's going on there?
Sure. Really quickly, just to say something about the death of the sun, I go into this in great detail in the book. We're not going anywhere. We're not leaving the solar system. That's just not happening, full stop. So that just means got to find a way to deal with the death of the sun, but also that's not going to be humans dealing with that. Humanity's not going to last that long. Even if we survive, our descendants will have drifted into some other species by that point. Anyway, AGI. It is ill-defined. I think the concept of intelligence is ill-defined. I mean, there's so much in Kurzweil's dream and the dream of uploading brains that just doesn't really work. The idea that there is this thing called intelligence that you can sort of quantify, and then the idea that you can get a machine's intelligence turned up to a point where it's smarter than a human or all humans. It's all pretty fuzzy, and yet there's enormous amounts of money being poured into this on the assumption that it'll all pan out, even though there's no reason to believe that and lots of reason not to. There's also an unspoken assumption in Kurzweil's dream, which is shared by so many of these tech billionaires, that the human mind is software running on the computer of the human brain. The brain is not a computer. Our experience of the world is not software running on a computer made of meat. I believe we are biological machines. I think that there's very good scientific evidence that that's what we are. But the definition of machine in there is quite a bit broader than just computer or even something designed and built, right? Because we evolved. And that's one of many, many differences between a computer and a brain. And I think some of the talk around AGI is intentionally vague, but I think some of it is just unintentionally vague. There's a strategic advantage to having certain terms be vaguely defined. George Orwell talked about this in his amazing essay, Politics in the English Language. He talked about how there are certain words that where the attempt to define them is resisted by all sides because it's politically disadvantageous to have these words have definitions. And these are often words like democracy or fascism. AGI has sort of become one of those things. And the definitions given are generally wildly bad. You know, if you go look at the OpenAI charter, they have a definition of AGI that is, and this is almost word for word, I'm not going to quite get it right, but the definition is something like a machine that can reproduce any economically productive activity that humans engage in. And that is vague, that's still vague, and weirdly narrow, right? Because the real definition of AGI is something like that stuff in science fiction. Something like Commander Data from Star Trek. That's AGI. That's what they're trying to do. And if that's really what you're aiming at, something that is like a human but in a computer, something that can do what humans do but in a computer or a robot, then any economically productive activity, there's all sorts of things that humans do that are not economically productive, that are an important part of like the human experience, and that you can't be a human without doing. You know, like if I take a long walk with a friend and we have a long and meaningful conversation about our personal lives or about what the world was like 50 million years ago, these are not economically productive activities. If I sit in my room and read a book that I got from the library, that's not an economically productive activity. If I daydream, if I make art, and these are all important parts of the human experience, right? Hell, if I have the flu, is that pleasant? No, but I do think that illness is actually kind of a part of the human experience too. If we could get rid of the flu, we should get rid of the flu. I'm not pro-flu. But yeah, I think it's a fantasy. It's not well-defined, and insofar as it is well-defined, it doesn't work. I mean, hell, there was a paper not too long ago where a bunch of people got together to try to define AGI because they'd heard too many people saying that it wasn't well-defined. Paper came out and was immediately dinged because some of the citations in the paper weren't real and had been hallucinated by AI.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, it's going real well, is what I'm saying.
Oh, man. And then critical to the dream of AGI, of course, is Moore's law, the observation that computer chips keep getting more powerful as engineers pack more transistors onto them, roughly doubling that power every 2 years. These technologists often assume AGI will arrive through continued exponential growth in computing power as described by Moore's law. How well is that assumption holding up now?
I mean, look, the one thing that we know is true of any exponential trend is that it ends. Gordon Moore certainly knew that about his own law. He said, I think this was somewhere around 2000, he said Moore's law's got to end. And if it keeps going at the rate that it's going, probably sometime in the 2020s. And you know what? He was right. And the reason he knew that, the reason he was able to predict that is Moore's law says that the number of transistors that you can pack into an integrated chip of a given size will double every 18 months. This means that the transistors have to get smaller. The chips are made of silicon. Silicon, like everything in our lives, is made of atoms. Atoms have a particular size. You can't make smaller silicon atoms. That one I'm pretty solid on. That's not going to happen. And you also can't make a silicon transistor out of something smaller than a single silicon atom-ish. And so once you get down to the size of an atom, you're done. And that is essentially where we are, or what we're on the verge of right now. And so Moore's law, depending on who you ask, is already dead or in the process of dying.
I thought it was interesting you included the Stanford MIT good ideas are getting harder to find paper that Kurzweil assumes Moore's law in everything, like a lot of these technologists do. Could you describe some of what you found in that paper?
Yeah, so, because you're absolutely right. Kurzweil assumes that Moore's law is like an iron law of the universe, and that it will continue to hold not just for transistors, but for absolutely everything, that there's this larger exponential trend. And he's not alone in this. I mean, Sam Altman had an essay called Moore's Law for Everything. And then I talk about that in my book as well. Like, this is just a widely believed thing. And it's not just OpenAI. Dario Amodei has a piece called Machines of Loving Grace, where he basically makes very similar claims about what could happen. But I think we all know on some level that there's such a thing as low-hanging fruit, that, no matter what it is that you're doing, there's always going to be the easy parts. And then as you keep going, it gets harder and harder to keep progressing at the same speed, right? Think of a jigsaw puzzle. You've got the edge pieces, and finding those is relatively easy, and getting them to line up is relatively easy. But you know what? The edges are one-dimensional, and there's less of them. Most of the puzzle, especially if it's a big puzzle, is in the middle, and that's harder. And so it gets harder and harder to finish the puzzle. Yes, that's artificial. That's not the same as discovering new science or inventing new technology or creating new art. But, think about learning a new skill. Part of the fun about picking up a new hobby is you get a lot better at it really quickly. And then you plateau. And then maybe you break through that plateau and you progress again and again. Not that long ago, I took up cycling up steep hills and discovered, to my amazement and delight, that I only had to do it a few times and I got a lot better really fast. The first time I went up this particular hill, I was, huffing and puffing and had to stop 4 or 5 times before I got to the top. And then I could do it stopping once. That's the way that this goes. This paper kind of suggests that everything's kind of like that, and that finding new ideas gets harder in any given field. And as we have more and more people doing science or building technology, it gets harder and harder to find new ideas because there's just been more and more people looking at this stuff for longer and longer. Do I fully buy that paper is correct in all of the particulars of its arguments? I'm not sure. I would like to see more work done in that area. Do I think that it's very reasonable to assume that many things obey a law of diminishing returns? Yes. And some of their particular examples are incredibly telling. They look at Moore's law because, of course, they do. They know that if you're going to make the kind of claim that they're making, someone's going to trot out Moore's law. And what they point out is, there's this doubling trend that's been going on, but the amount of money and resources that's been poured into each doubling of Moore's law has been going up and up to the point where achieving a single doubling of the number of transistors in, I think it was like 2018, is something like 20 times the resources that it took to achieve the same doubling like 50 years earlier or something like that.
So right now, the Moore's law and the AI boom and the hope of AGI rests on the performance of large language models known as LLMs. What do you think LLMs can realistically do? What are their fundamental limits, especially when we factor in energy, materials, cost, any other weaknesses you see inherent to large language models?
I am not enough of an expert to say where the limit to what an LLM can do might lie, but I know enough to say three things. First of all, they're always going to require enormous amounts of energy, data, you name it, and they are starting to run up against those limits. Second, fundamentally what they do is they predict the next thing in a sequence based on training data. And so that means that they are always going to be better at doing the kind of thing that's already in the training data rather than doing something fundamentally new. They'll be better at interpolating rather than extrapolating, which I think really puts the lie to ideas about LLMs really accelerating science, which is something you'll hear over and over again, especially from Sam Altman. And third, they are fundamentally random. And because of that, and because they are fundamentally about predicting the next word, they will always hallucinate, because hallucination is all they do. They have no notion of truth and falsehood. What they know is what is likely to happen next in the given sequence. And whether or not that realistically reflects what's in the actual world, what's actually possible, that's not something that enters into the calculation at all. I was actually just yesterday reading a really lovely piece that I haven't finished reading by Neil Seth about LLMs and AI and the brain. And one of the points that he makes is, similar approaches have been used for things that aren't language, like AlphaFold. No one thinks that AlphaFold might be conscious. It's just language usage creates this phenomenon that I talk about in the book, pareidolia, the appearance of the illusion of a pattern or of something human, where in fact it's just randomness.
And you've seen this, and we've seen this. We've had a few guests talking about this trend that many people in Silicon Valley, these tech billionaires, identify as long-termists. And we've had folks like Emil Torres and Alice Crary to, expose some of the ideology. How would you describe the moral framework of long-termism, particularly ideas like total view utilitarianism, the repugnant conclusion, and existential risk? And, furthermore, how does that moral framework justify their calls for extreme growth in population? A lot of these people are also ardent pronatalists. Energy use and technological power and all of that growth.
God, that's a big question. And I'm not going to be able to define all of those terms and answer the question. So the really short answer is read my book. The slightly less short answer, it's tempting to call this view utilitarianism on steroids, or like galaxy brain utilitarianism. I actually think that in a way, what's more striking about it is its obsession with metrics, quantification of absolutely everything, which I suppose you could say, well, but that's utilitarianism. And yeah, that's probably right. But there is a notion that absolutely everything is measurable, and thus only what is measurable matters. And because what long-termists believe is that people in the future count and are overriding moral considerations for the present. But they take that in a way that I think perverts the idea of ethics itself. Because, of course, we should consider people who come after us in our actions. We absolutely should. And we do that when we do things like say, well, we need to preserve our biosphere. We need to not use all of the natural resources. We have to think about the people who will come after us. Although, with some of those things, we're getting to the point where, no, we need to think about ourselves in 10 to 15 years, but still. But the long-termists take this and say, oh, well, but, if one happy person is great, then 10 happy people is 10 times as good, and a billion happy people is a billion times as good. And so the most happy people is what we should be going for, and that means the most people. And then make them happy. And then this leads you to this thing, the repugnant conclusion that a very large number of barely happy people is better than a world in which the overall population is smaller, but people are living more fulfilled lives. And this can go to pretty extreme places, as I describe in my book. But this means that not only are they pronatalists, but they're also big fans of not just interplanetary colonization, but interstellar, galactic, intergalactic colonization, which that's not happening. I'm not going to get into that, but all I will say is a light year is really big. And the nearest stars are light years away, and the nearest galaxies are millions of light years away. And if you want to know more, you can read my book. Because I could do a whole podcast on why that's not happening, why we're not leaving the solar system. But it leads to this obsession with growth, this obsession with making sure there's lots of people, with seeing the world as a set of resources that we can just extract, and seeing anything other than humans or conscious organisms who are experiencing happiness as a wasted opportunity, as opposed to the natural world, at least some of which I think we have no right to interfere with. It's a really perverse and extreme ideology that ignores limits and ignores the real plight of people here and now in exchange for a hypothetical possibility in the future. You know, they talk about existential risk. They talk about the possibility of a superintelligent AI killing us all. That's not going to happen. That's another thing that we could talk about all podcast long, and we're not going to do. You know, what about risks that don't rise to the level of existential? What if they're wrong about what constitutes an existential risk? I think, and there's very good arguments that I have to back this up, that they are completely wrong about the existential risk of AI. They think that's the single most important problem. The fact that we can have such a wild disagreement about that indicates that something's up with their moral framework. If they're saying, no, that's the most important thing and we have to do that, and I'm saying that's a distraction from the real problems of the world. And they're also using their power and influence, and they have a fair amount of it, to push people to work on that at the expense of other problems. You know, Toby Ord, one of the biggest names in this community, has said that the risk of human extinction over the next 100 years, or unrecoverable civilizational collapse from runaway AI, is 50 times greater than that from global warming or nuclear war combined. I think this is a profoundly ill-informed and irresponsible statement to make, and I think pushing that message is wrong. I think he's done a great harm in the world by doing that.
And to our dismay and yours, so many people are buying into this, especially because they've co-opted a term like long-term, you know, which long-term thinking has existed in, for example, Haudenosaunee principle of 7 generations. But a lot of people just think long-termism kind of sounds like that, so it must be a good moral framework. But as you just said, it's delusional at best, dangerous at worst.
Yeah, I mean, like if Musk has said that long-termism is a close match for his philosophy, but what I find myself thinking about actually a lot is Bezos saying, yeah, if we've got 1 trillion people living in the solar system, we can have 1,000 Mozarts and 1,000 Einsteins. And like, okay, we've probably got people of that level of potential and capability living and dying in poverty right now. What about those people? Because one of the things that this does is this, you know, what I call in the book, the ideology of technological salvation. It just gives everyone a hall pass, you know, a get out of jail free card for thinking about the impact that their actions are having here and now. And, you know, the long-termists will say, oh, but, you know, we donate a lot to people in the developing world and, you know, interventions that will improve healthcare outcomes. And like, okay, first of all, you know, there are some arguments that actually the work that they're doing there is not that great. But putting that aside, what about systemic change? What about why there's such massive disparities in the world in the first place? This is a set of philosophies that just reinforce extractive logic, global capitalism, colonialism, like all of these ideas, all of these frameworks of power that we have in the world that have led to such an unequal and unjust world and have ultimately led to the erosion of democracy all around the world. These are problems that you can't solve by donating a few malaria nets or even a large number of malaria nets. That's not how you deal with those problems. And if we don't deal with those problems, I would argue that that's an existential threat to humanity. But also what gets to be an existential threat and the people for whom threats to them get to be called existential. These are questions of power. And that is something that this, you know, the long-termist framework is not built to think about well. And there have been instances of people concerned about AI risk or people who subscribe to this kind of long-termist thinking being given opportunities to exercise power and doing it in a really naive way, or in some cases criminal. And more broadly, this ideology of technological salvation that all of these different things are kind of manifestations of are ways of excusing the existing power structure and allowing it to persist in order to aim at an impossible utopia and save us from a non-existent apocalypse.
And you talk about some of the biggest believers of technological salvation are the effective accelerationists.
Yeah.
Could you go on about them for a bit?
I'd really rather not. They're so unpleasant. I'll go on about them for a little bit so we get time to get to more stuff. The effective accelerationists think, oh, yeah, this is all great. They're very explicit about this. They say, oh, what we need more of is growth and consumption, and we just need to go faster and make progress go faster and make AI go faster. And like, okay, once again, first of all, you're not defining any of your terms. What do you mean by go faster? Make progress go faster is like, I would argue, probably hopelessly ill-defined. I don't think that you can actually define that. You know, well, how fast does progress go? Well, 1 year per year last time I checked. But it's so nakedly uninterested at best in the evils perpetrated and harms perpetrated by capitalism, colonialism, growth, you name it. And that's at best. I would argue that a lot of these people actually think that those harms are good, actually. You know, a lot of these people are very openly racist and have professed a belief that in not just eugenics, but in like discredited racist pseudoscience that says that, you know, some people are just born better than others and that lines up with socially constructed racial boundaries. And all of that's nonsense and, you know, hateful nonsense. But these people believe that they know better than the experts. And I don't just mean the effective accelerationists. I mean the tech billionaires and the people in these other movements like Longtermism, effective altruism. Like there's just a persistent belief that we know how to do it right. Everyone else is getting it wrong. We know how to do science better than the scientists. We know how to do ethics better than any other ethicists who have come before us. We know how to make the world a better place to live than anyone else who's ever been alive. Like, well, you know, these are questions that have been debated for thousands of years, and it's not because everybody else who's ever lived was stupid. It's because these are difficult questions. And, you know, we have specialists and experts for a reason. It's because the world is a fundamentally complicated place. But if you believe that you are wealthy and successful because you are smart, and if you believe that you are the wealthiest and most successful person who's ever lived because you're the smartest person who's ever lived, then you're sort of forced to believe that the world is a simple place. Because anything that you can't understand must not be important or must not be real. And you can't possibly be an expert in everything because the world is just too complicated. And frankly, humans have been around for so long that there's just so much knowledge that you could never learn in one human lifetime. But none of that can possibly matter. And so instead, your simplistic ideas must be correct. And anything that reinforces your power, well, that's probably good too, because you know better than everyone. And so if someone says, well, you know, yeah, there's a bunch of scientists who think that racist pseudoscience isn't real, but what do they know? I know more about genetics than geneticists. I know more about the genome than genomicists. I know more about the history of human civilization than historians because I have a net worth of $1 billion. And if they were so smart, how come they're poor?
And this is the kind of stuff that leads to people like Malcolm and Simone Collins to be platformed.
I'm sorry. I just can't take them seriously. They're so ridiculous. Like, they're seriously awful people, but they keep getting platformed. And let's be very clear. Malcolm Collins slapped his 3-year-old son really hard right in front of a journalist. That's horrifying. Yeah, they keep getting platformed because A, they are awful in a way that drives clicks, the rage bait and clickbait, right? But I wouldn't be surprised if Malcolm Collins decided that he wanted to do that in order to drive more clicks, but also maybe not. Maybe he does that all the time. Which one's worse? I don't know. But I mean, look, that's eugenics right there. And also their idea, it's not just racist. It's also stupid because it won't work. And it won't work because it turns out they're just wrong about how genetics works. They're wrong about how raising kids works, right? Like, oh, I want to have a large number of people agree with me about things. What I'm going to do that is have an enormous number of children and then indoctrinate them. Because you know what never happens is kids never disagree with their parents. And when they're adults, they always agree with what their parents believed. Right? That's something that's just true, right? I mean, everybody knows that teenagers are really well behaved and hate rebellion. It doesn't make any sense from any perspective. So yeah, I mostly think that they are ignorant attention seekers who are probably abusing their kids. Oh, also racist and misogynist. Yeah.
Right. Misogyny.
Yes.
We haven't
even talked about
gotten
misogyny.
to that.
Yeah. There's lots of misogyny.
Yes. But you also suggest that, beneath the ideology of technological salvation that's undergirding all of this work is a big fear. It's a fear of an end, fear of death. Can you briefly speak to how that fear is shaping their relationship to nature, to ecology, to limits on the planet?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I will mention Malcolm and Simone Collins one more time and then we'll be done. Someone who wants to have that many kids and indoctrinate them to believe exactly what they believe, that sure looks like fear of death to me. And Ray Kurzweil is very open about how it was the death of his father who sort of like pushed him to postulate all this stuff that he believes about the singularity. And, death is horrifying. Makes sense to be afraid of death. And I think it would be great if we could eliminate more causes of death. I think it would be great if we could allow people to live longer, healthier lives. But I also think that the science is pretty clear that death's not going anywhere. And also the science is pretty clear that we need to find a way to live in harmony with our environment. I don't think that doing that is impossible, but if you just have an overwhelming fear of death and at all costs you need not to die, it makes you very selfish and it makes you disconnected from reality because death's not going anywhere. And it also, I think we're seeing it lead to a disregard for the natural world. And even if the only thing that you care about is intelligent beings building civilizations, and I would argue that you should care about more than that, you have to let the world be in a way that other intelligent beings could evolve and, have their time in the sun. One of the things that made me the most angry when I was writing this book was seeing people quote Carl Sagan as a justification for their views. And I was like, oh, you want to play the let's quote Carl Sagan game? Fine. Let's play that game. You want to come into my house? You want to talk about space and you want to talk about Carl Sagan and you want to talk about science fiction? Fine, let's do that. I was born ready for this. But Sagan said if there is even something as simple as bacterium on Mars, we shouldn't touch it. We should leave it for the Martians. And I think that's just true. But if you're afraid of death, nobody and nothing else matters. If you're that afraid of death, I'm afraid of death. I'd be afraid if it looked like I was about to die, but I don't let that be an overriding concern that governs my entire life because otherwise I'd never be alive. And, I'm never going to have $1 billion and I don't want that. It's not something that's important to me, but I'd like to think that if I had $1 billion, I'd give a lot of it away, but I'd also, find a way to have some fun. I've just never seen anyone more miserable in a position of such power and wealth than Elon Musk. Can you call that living? Here's a dude who just lives in fear every day. I would not want to be him for anything. I'd much rather live a real life.
So the technologist worldview assumes agreement, for the most part, on social ends, like the long-termist focus on the happiness of trillions, future humans and their utility, and it collapses a lot of the political social disagreement into these purely kind of technical problems. But democratically based politics is messy, contingent, and perfect. It's full of compromise, and it's not authoritarianism. What does democratic, meaningful resistance to the tech billionaires look like?
I mean, Like I say in the book, there's this idea that they have that you can solve any problem by throwing technology at it. And we know that that's not true. There's all sorts of problems in the world that can't be solved simply by throwing technology at them. There are problems that we have the technological solutions for, that we don't need better technology to solve, right? Like nuclear war being at the top of that list. We know how to dismantle every single nuclear weapon in the world. That's a solved problem from a technical perspective. We've just chosen collectively not to do it. We could end the threat of nuclear war tomorrow. These are problems of collective action and politics, not technology, by and large. I think that part of the reason I wrote this book is that I think there's an underappreciated political power in defining what the future looks like. And these tech billionaires are trying to grab that power and run with it and set the terms on which we talk about the future. And I don't want to let them do that because they have no idea what they're talking about and they're incredibly cruel. And so I think talking about the future in a different way and making it clear, oh yeah, that's hot nonsense. That's not happening. That's stuff that those billionaires are selling us. It's just a product that they're trying to sell us and we shouldn't buy it. So talking about it, I think, is part of the solution. I think being aware that the stuff we've been told about AI and the stuff that we've been told about, our glorious future in space and the stuff we've been told about technology, it's all just a story and it's not a particularly well-supported one. And there's good arguments against it. I think that also, especially here in the US, there's a sense of hopelessness about fighting these entrenched powers, especially, given how tight they are with the Trump administration. But there's more of us than there are of them. And I think that they have underestimated the lengths to which people will go to retain control over their own lives and not cede that control to an idiot dictator or clueless tech billionaires. I think that also we don't all work for the big tech companies, but a lot of people know someone who works for those companies. Encourage them to unionize. Like organized political power and organized labor power are the ways out of this mess. We cannot let these oligarchs decide what the future of our species is. If we want to fight back against them, we need to take advantage of the fact that there is more of us than there are of them. And how do we do that? We organize. And some of that's political, some of that's at the ballot box. I still believe in the power of the ballot box. And we are going to have a very important election in this country this year, and Trump is not going to be able to cancel it, no matter what some people online might say. But also labor power can do a lot and can do a lot quickly, because it is what these tech billionaires are terrified of, that their workers will wake up one day and realize, wait, I don't like what my CEO is doing. Yes, the tech CEOs have lined up behind Trump. The rank and file workers at the big tech companies in the US mostly hate Trump. And so I think this is a ripe opportunity to try to bring those billionaires to heel and say, oh, you're doing something that everyone who works for you hates. They could just stop. And then what would your money be worth?
That's a really helpful answer. And Adam, we know you have to go, so we'll wrap this up. But thank you so much for your time and for doing the really important work that, like you said earlier in the interview, only you could have done, just given the overlap in interests and the background that you have in astrophysics and science. We love that you are trying to be more like Carl Sagan in your communication of science. We need people like you, and we are grateful for your time today. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the work that you're doing, getting the word out about this stuff.
That's all for this edition of Overshoot. Visit populationbalance.org to learn more. To share feedback or guest recommendations, write to us using the contact form on our site or by emailing us at podcast@populationbalance.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on your favorite podcast platform and share it widely. We couldn't do this work without the support of listeners like you, and hope that you'll consider a one-time or recurring donation.
Until next time, I'm Nandita Bajaj, thanking you for your interest in our work and for helping to advance our vision of shrinking toward abundance.